Snow rages across a forgotten Colorado town as Jack Turner, a broken veteran, faces the world's harsh judgment and a wounded bobcat desperate for help. When fate brings man and beast together in the middle of a blizzard, neither could imagine the secret in the storm will test the meaning of family, forgiveness, and survival itself. Sometimes healing finds you in the wildest ways. Where are you watching from? If you believe in second chances like this story, then subscribe for more journeys that might just mend your heart. Most people never noticed Jack Turner anymore. In the snow-covered mountain town of White Pine, Colorado, Jack was the invisible man. A shadow flickering past fogged windows and rattling doors, a name spat with a curl of the lip. Years ago, folks whispered stories about him. Jack Turner, ex-Marine, could run a mountain blindfolded, didn't blink at trouble, always kept his word. Now the whispers had faded into one phrase: town failure. At 48, Jack's shoulders bore the weight of his regrets more heavily than the canvas coat he wore every day, its sleeves frayed and stained from too many winters. On a frozen January morning, Jack lingered outside a roadside diner where truckers and old-timers gathered for black coffee and gossip. He stood apart from the laughter and warmth, hands jammed deep in his pockets, eyes locked on the snow swirling across the asphalt. No one invited him in. They had stopped inviting years ago. But that morning, something different happened. Something that would tear open the routines and wounds of Jack's solitary existence. Through the blur of falling snow, Jack spotted a flash of movement by the junkyard fence. At first, he thought it was a stray dog, maybe a coyote drawn down from the high country. But as the shape limped into the open, a low, powerful form, mottled with tawny and ash gray, wild and unmistakable, Jack's breath caught. It was a bobcat, large and ragged, fur clumped with ice, its right hind leg dragging behind it. A bloody patch marred its flank, but its eyes burned gold and fierce. The animal was wounded, desperate but still proud. Something in that broken majesty mirrored Jack's own spirit. A stubborn refusal to bow even when the world had stripped everything else away. Jack watched as the bobcat hunkered near the rim of an old oil drum, nostrils flaring, searching for warmth or scraps. The diner door banged open. Two men stepped out, boots crunching, laughter echoing. The bobcat froze, then melted away into the shadow of the junkyard, vanishing between heaps of twisted metal and snow-cloaked tires. Jack lingered a moment longer, drawn by the raw need in the animal's eyes, a need he recognized deep inside himself. He turned his back on the diner and the warmth he wasn't welcome to, trudging toward the junkyard as the wind howled down from the mountains. Each step took him further from town, from the places where his name meant only failure, and closer to something wild and unfinished. The junkyard belonged to Silas McGrady, an old friend, if such a word could be used for a man who hadn't spoken to Jack in months. The yard sprawled like a graveyard for broken things. Rusted-out pickups, shattered glass, the skeletons of snowmobiles, old RVs, scraps piled into crude mountains. The wind snatched at Jack's coat as he pushed through the gate, boots sinking into the frozen crust of the ground. Silas was out back, welding torch flaring blue against the dull gray sky. He glanced up, his eyes sharp beneath bushy white brows. "You lost, Turner?" he called, voice gruff as always. Jack shook his head. "Looking for something," he answered. He almost said someone. Silas snorted and turned back to his work, but Jack knew he was being watched. He scanned the yard for any sign of the bobcat, heart pounding, senses alert. Tracks in the snow, fresh, small, pointed, led toward a battered shed and the far edge of the yard, where a heap of old RVs rusted under a drift of snow. He followed the tracks, breath curling in the air. At the edge of the yard sat an abandoned Winnebago, its paint peeling, windows spiderwebbed with cracks, a remnant of family road trips long past. The animal tracks veered behind it. Jack knelt, moving slowly, eyes searching. Under the edge of the RV's frame, he glimpsed the bobcat again, curled tightly, shivering with pain but baring its teeth in a silent snarl. Its flank heaved with ragged breaths. Jack didn't move. He simply sat, letting the silence stretch between them, two wounded creatures meeting in the dead of winter. The wind stung his face, but he held still, watching as the bobcat's eyelids fluttered, exhaustion warring with fear. Snowflakes landed on its fur, melting into tiny rivulets that ran down to the earth. As the minutes ticked by, Jack found himself whispering, not to the animal, but to the shadows of his past. He remembered the way his own daughter used to watch him fix things in the garage, her small hands steadying the flashlight as he worked. He remembered the night he walked away from his family, hoping to protect them from the worst of himself, but instead leaving them wounded and lost, just like the creature before him. The wind shifted. The smell of hot metal drifted from Silas's torch, mingling with the sharp, wild scent of the bobcat. Jack stood, eyes lingering on the wounded animal. "I'll be back," he murmured. "I promise." As he left the shelter of the Winnebago, Jack felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years. Purpose, as fragile as a flame in the wind. He trudged back to Silas, who was wiping grease from his hands. "Silas," Jack said, "that old Winnebago. How much you want for it?" Silas grinned, a flash of the old days in his eyes. "Hell, you want that rust bucket? Give me $1 and a reason, it's yours." Jack fished in his pocket, pulling out a wrinkled bill. "Deal." As snow began to fall harder, Jack glanced once more at the bobcat hidden behind the RV. In the mirror of that wild, wounded creature, he saw the first spark of hope, the kind that comes not from running, but from facing the broken things and daring to fix them, no matter the scars. The deal was sealed with the press of a wrinkled dollar bill and the kind of handshake that meant more than money ever could in a place like White Pine. For Jack, the battered Winnebago represented more than just another piece of junk in Silas's yard. It was a chance, slim as a sliver of sunlight in the bleak Colorado winter, to start over. Jack wasted no time. He cleared a path to the RV with a snow shovel, breath steaming, arms burning as he broke through the ice-encrusted drifts. Every thud of the shovel seemed to echo his determination, each cleared step a reminder that action, no matter how small, could chip away at the glacier that had frozen his life in place. The RV's door was stubborn with rust. Jack leaned his shoulder against it until the hinges finally gave, the sound sharp and jarring in the silent yard. Inside, the air was thick with the musk of mildew and forgotten summers. Dust motes spun in the weak sunlight. The floor was littered with old blankets, beer cans, and the yellowed remains of road maps tracing journeys cut short. Jack ran his hand over the warped counter and splintered wood, every flaw whispering of neglect and hope deferred. But beneath the rot, he sensed a core of strength, a framework waiting for a second chance. He fetched his battered toolbox from the shed and set to work. The tasks were endless, rotten paneling to rip out, cracked glass to measure, rusted fixtures to unbolt. Each repair was a test of patience, a meditation on effort and endurance. Jack's fingers, once quick and sure, ached with every motion. But as the hours passed, the rhythm of work steadied his mind. For the first time in years, his thoughts moved with purpose, not regret. Between bouts of work, Jack never forgot the wild shadow lurking nearby. The bobcat, wounded and wary, lingered at the fringes of the yard. Jack left scraps of food, a few slices of roast beef from the diner's trash, a bowl of water near the shed. He kept his distance, refusing to crowd the animal with any show of pity. Trust, he knew, could not be forced. It had to be earned, patiently, over time. Snowstorms swept down from the peaks, battering the junkyard in white silence. Jack worked through the cold, sometimes pausing to watch the bobcat pick its way across the drifts, every step careful and pained. He began to understand the animal's fierce independence, its unwillingness to give in, even when survival meant moving on 3 legs and fighting off hunger in the biting wind. Late one night, while Jack sanded a cabinet door inside the Winnebago, he heard a faint scratching at the shed's threshold. He opened the door and saw the bobcat, shivering, eyes wide with fear, but too exhausted to flee. Blood had soaked through the ragged fur of its hind leg. Jack hesitated only a moment before stepping aside, letting the animal limp into the relative warmth of the small space. He laid down an old horse blanket in a corner, retreating to the opposite side of the shed so the creature could settle on its own terms. There was a kind of silent agreement between them. Jack offered food and shelter, but he did not reach out to touch or comfort. The bobcat watched him with sharp, haunted eyes, never fully relaxing but no longer bristling with threat. As the storm raged outside, Jack worked by lantern light, glancing up now and then to see the wild shape curled, tense but alive, at the edge of his world. Days slid by in a pattern of restoration and survival. Jack spent daylight hours rebuilding the Winnebago, fighting rust and rot with whatever tools he could scavenge. At night, he listened to the wind howl over the mountains, feeling the fragile presence of his wild companion in the darkness. Each small victory, the patching of a leak, the replacement of a broken hinge, the slow healing of the bobcat's wound, felt like a stitch in the unraveling fabric of his life. He sometimes wondered if the people in town would ever see him differently, if fixing the RV or caring for a wounded animal could somehow redeem the years he'd lost. But such thoughts faded in the presence of steady labor. There was only the task at hand, the drive to keep moving, to keep building. One morning, as the sun painted the snowfields in gold, Jack stepped out of the Winnebago and found the bobcat waiting by the door. Its limp was less pronounced, eyes brighter than before. For the briefest moment, the animal met his gaze without fear or anger, a fleeting truce forged in the shared struggle against the cold. Jack nodded to the bobcat, a gesture of respect between two survivors. He realized that in nursing the animal, he had begun to nurse his own wounds. The broken Winnebago, the scarred bobcat, and the fractured man. Each was a piece of something shattered, each now bound by the hope that what was damaged could, with enough care and determination, be made whole again. As night fell, Jack sat in the shed, the bobcat resting nearby, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to dream, not of the past he'd ruined, but of a future rebuilt from broken things. The days that followed blurred into a pattern, one that for the first time in years brought Jack Turner something like peace. He rose each morning to the sound of wind brushing snow against the shed's walls, the sky bruised purple before dawn. Jack slipped quietly from his narrow cot, checked on the bobcat, then headed out to face the battered Winnebago. Work became its own kind of sanctuary, stripping away rot, sanding wood until his arms ached, patching holes and fitting new glass panes where old ones had shattered. The rhythm of labor soothed him. In the dim light, Jack lost himself in measuring, sawing, and hammering. His thoughts quiet except for the memory of hands steady from years of discipline and survival. The bitterness that usually colored the edges of his mind. Regret, shame, that gnawing sense of failure, faded under the grind of work. Each board replaced, each screw tightened, was a small victory over the past. The Bobcat remained, a constant if unpredictable presence. Sometimes it watched him from the doorway, green eyes wary but curious, its wound slowly healing. Other times, it would disappear for hours, only to return at dusk and curl in the shadows near Jack's feet. Trust was not immediate. It was a fragile truce built day by day, tested in silence and small gestures. Jack left the shed door open now, allowing the animal freedom to come and go. He noticed that the limp grew less pronounced, and its movements more confident as the weeks passed. Jack didn't allow himself to hope for more. He expected the calm to break. He knew from a lifetime of hardship that peace was only borrowed in a world like this, but he let himself feel its warmth, as if holding his breath underwater, waiting for the moment he would have to surface again. That moment came sooner than he wished. One afternoon, as icy sunlight spilled over the junkyard, the silence was broken by the sharp ring of Jack's cell phone. The device, unused for weeks, vibrated across the dusty workbench, its screen flashing a name that stopped Jack cold. Emily. For a few seconds, Jack stared, heart pounding, memories flooding in, his daughter's freckled cheeks, the sound of her laughter before it soured into anger, the years he'd lost. He hesitated, then answered, his voice rough with disuse. Her words tumbled out quickly, each syllable edged with distance and accusation. She was pregnant. She was not calling to ask for help or forgiveness. Her tone remained cold, clipped, businesslike. Just the facts, no room for sentiment. Still, Jack clung to each word, a lifeline thrown into the storm of his thoughts. He congratulated her softly, the words catching in his throat, but the call ended with a sharp, polite goodbye and the hollow click of disconnection. The shed seemed to close in on him then, the shadows deepening. Jack sat motionless, the weight of the past pressing down, old wounds reopened by the sound of his daughter's voice. He stared at the Bobcat, who regarded him with something close to understanding, a fellow exile, both scarred and wary. That night, a bitter wind screamed through the mountains, rattling the windows of the Winnebago. Sleep would not come, chased away by memories and longing. Jack stepped outside, his boots crunching over hard-packed snow. The moon lit the yard in a cold blue wash, the world silent except for the distant howl of coyotes. He made his way to the shed, expecting to find the Bobcat curled on its blanket. Instead, the corner was empty. Panic prickled along Jack's spine. He scanned the snow for tracks. There, a thin trail of blood led away from the shed and into the woods, each step evidence of pain and struggle. Jack's breath caught. For a moment, he considered turning back. It was not his place to follow, not his right to intrude on the animal's wildlife. But something deeper compelled him forward, an instinct to protect, to not abandon those in need, no matter how many times he'd failed before. He gathered a flashlight and followed the trail, the snow muffling every footstep. The woods closed in, branches hung heavy with icicles, the wind biting through his coat. He moved quickly, senses sharpened by worry. The trail wound through brambles, over a frozen creek, and up a rise beneath towering pines. As he walked, Jack's mind flashed with memory. Emily as a child, racing through tall grass, her hand in his. The ache of watching her grow distant the moment she slammed the door and left him alone in the house they'd once called home. Regret pressed in, thick as the dark around him. He'd always convinced himself he was beyond saving, that some wounds never healed. Yet the bobcat had stayed, accepted his care, even if only out of necessity. Perhaps redemption wasn't about erasing the past, but shouldering it, carrying it forward step by painful step. The trail disappeared under the shadow of a fallen log. Jack paused, searching for any sign of the animal. For a moment he feared he was too late, that his companion had vanished into the endless wilderness, leaving him to reckon with loss once again. But a faint rustling in the underbrush urged him onward, a flicker of hope beneath the heavy sky. Jack pressed on, feeling the old stubbornness rise in him. He would not abandon the bobcat. Not now. Not when the world had already turned its back on both of them. In that cold, endless night, he promised himself that, no matter the cost, he would follow the wounded trail as far as it led, for the sake of the wild creature, and the family he was desperate to mend. The blood trail glimmered in the moonlight, a thin red thread woven through the white silence of the forest. Jack Turner pressed forward, feet crunching over old ice and brittle twigs, each step drawing him deeper into the mountain's cold heart. The cold burned his lungs, but he forced himself onward, driven by a stubborn urgency that refused to let him turn back. Every few yards, he paused, scanning the snow for signs of movement, for any trace that the bobcat, his wild companion, was still alive. Branches scratched his face and snagged his coat as he pushed through dense undergrowth. Above him, the night sky pressed close, thick with clouds that threatened more snow. The only sounds were his own labored breathing and the far-off howl of some distant animal. Maybe a coyote, maybe something else. Jack's flashlight beam darted across the forest floor, illuminating scattered tufts of fur and splashes of crimson. His heart hammered in his chest. He remembered the way the bobcat had looked at him, defiant, yet trusting enough to accept his presence. That fragile trust had become a tether between them, pulling him onward, compelling him to prove, if only to himself, that he wouldn't abandon the creature as he had once abandoned his own family. After what felt like hours, Jack crested a ridge and stumbled into a shallow clearing. In the center, snow draped over a fallen pine, its massive trunk half buried, branches tangled in a rough lattice. Beneath the trunk, a dim shape writhed, a flash of mottled fur, a growl that crackled through the night air. Jack's breath caught as he drew closer. There, half pinned beneath the weight of the branch, lay the bobcat, sides heaving with exhaustion. But she wasn't alone. Around her, barely visible against the snow, huddled 3 tiny kittens. Their eyes blinked blindly, mewling weakly in the cold. One tried to crawl out from beneath the shelter of its mother's battered body, only to collapse, shivering. The mother bobcat snarled, lips curling back to bare her teeth, torn between the instinct to defend and the desperation of her predicament. Jack took in the scene, his mind racing. He knew the animal was close to her breaking point. If he didn't act, the cold would claim them all. Moving slowly, he knelt at the edge of the fallen tree, keeping his hands visible, his voice low and steady even though no words left his mouth. The mother's golden eyes locked onto him, wild with pain and fear, but she made no move to flee. She had no energy left to run. Snow fell harder, swirling around them in thickening sheets. Jack scanned the situation. The pine branch was heavy, but not immovable. He dug his boots into the snow, braced his shoulders against the trunk, and pushed. Muscles burned, scars pulled, sweat chilled against his skin, but the branch refused to budge. He paused, caught his breath, and tried again. This time gritting his teeth and channeling every ounce of strength left in his battered frame. Inch by inch, the branch shifted, scraping over frozen earth. With one final heave, Jack managed to lift it just high enough for the mother bobcat to squirm free, dragging her kittens out behind her. As soon as the immediate danger passed, the mother lunged, claws raking across Jack's forearm in a desperate defensive swipe. Blood welled up, staining the snow. Jack jerked back, but didn't retaliate. He understood. Fear and instinct were stronger than gratitude. The bobcat circled her kittens, hissing low in her throat, eyes still wary but no longer feral with panic. Jack rocked back on his heels, pain throbbing in his arm, breathless with adrenaline. He watched as the mother checked her young, licking their faces, drawing them close beneath her chest. The kittens mewled and burrowed into her fur, safe once more for a fleeting moment. Jack's vision blurred, a mix of pain, cold, and a flood of emotion he hadn't let himself feel in years. He pressed his bleeding arm against his coat and waited, letting the storm rage around them. The bobcat did not attack again. Slowly, she seemed to realize he meant no harm. She allowed him to inch closer, to wrap the shivering kittens in an old shirt from his pack, to gather them up as gently as he could. The mother watched every move, tense and trembling, but did not strike. It was a silent, uneasy truce, built in the heart of a winter storm. Jack cradled the kittens to his chest, their tiny bodies barely warm against his skin. The mother limped alongside, never more than a few feet away, her golden gaze sharp with warning and trust in equal measure. Together, they made their way back through the woods, the trail slow and treacherous, marked by blood and hope. At the edge of the junkyard, the storm broke. Snow fell softly now, blanketing the world in white. Jack led the bobcat and her kittens into the safety of the shed, laying them gently in the nest he'd built beside the old stove. The mother collapsed beside her young, watching Jack with an expression he couldn't quite read, something between gratitude and sorrow. Jack sank to the floor, blood dripping onto the boards, exhaustion flooding his limbs. As he looked at the wild family he had saved, a question gnawed at his soul. Could a creature born to the wild ever truly trust a man who had once abandoned his own family? Was redemption even possible, or was this moment of fragile connection, all he could ever hope for? Outside, the storm faded into silence. Inside the shed, for the first time in a long while, Jack allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, some broken things could be mended. Dawn crept across the mountains, spilling pale light through the cracks in the shed's walls. Jack Turner lay awake on the cold floor, the throbbing ache in his arm a constant reminder of the wild night before. The kittens slept nestled against their mother, tiny sides rising and falling, their fragile bodies warmed by the gentle rhythm of her breathing. Jack watched them in the hush before sunrise, marveling at their survival and the fierce tenderness that had kept them alive against all odds. He gathered himself slowly, rising with stiff limbs to tend to his wounds. His arm was raw and swollen, blood dried in jagged lines where the bobcat's claws had torn through flesh. Jack found an old first aid kit in the Winnebago's battered cabinets. He cleaned the wounds with shaking hands, wrapping them as best he could. Each wince reminded him of the night's chaos, but beneath the pain was something steadier, a sense of responsibility, of purpose. He was here. He had chosen to stay and fight for something, even if it left scars. As Jack moved about the shed, the bobcat eyed him, wary but exhausted. Her kittens pressed close. There was an unspoken understanding now, a fragile peace. Jack kept his distance, working quietly to set out water and scraps of food. The kittens mewed softly, their voices barely audible. The mother tolerated his presence, too tired to threaten. Her trust earned one hesitant moment at a time. Just as Jack began to hope the worst was behind them, the sound of tires crunching over ice shattered the calm. He glanced up sharply, heart pounding. Outside, an old pickup rolled to a stop at the edge of the junkyard. Two doors slammed. Then familiar voices called out, sharp and searching, their echoes carrying on the cold air. Jack's breath caught. He knew those voices better than his own. Emily and Luke. He stepped out of the shed as his daughter and son crossed the yard, their faces pinched against the cold. Emily, pregnant and proud, took in the scene with a single sweeping glance. Her father's bloodied arm, the dilapidated Winnebago, the chaos of the workshop, the wild animals hidden inside. Disappointment and something sharper flickered across her eyes. Luke stood by her side, arms folded, jaw set hard as stone. Jack tried to greet them, but his words fell flat, snared by a sudden shyness. Emily cut him off, her tone strained, as if struggling to keep her anger contained. She looked at his filthy clothes, the cuts on his arm, the makeshift animal den. There was no admiration in her gaze, only worry, confusion, and an old, bone-deep hurt. She shook her head, voice cracking, and said she didn't need a crazy grandfather for her baby. What she needed, she said, was a sober father, someone who could show up, someone she could trust. Her words landed with the weight of stones. Jack stood silent, unable to defend himself. Every apology caught in his throat. He had no excuse for the years lost, the bridges burned, the absence that haunted each of their lives. He saw the fear in Emily's eyes, the fear that he would never be more than this broken man, lost in his own mistakes, hiding among ruined things and wild creatures. Luke lingered behind her, his silence a judgment all its own. The air between them prickled with old wounds and unsaid words. Jack's hands trembled as he wiped the blood from his palm onto his jeans, shame burning through him like a fever. For a moment, he wished he could disappear, fade into the snow, vanish into the woods, become just another ghost in the mountains. But the shed door was open. The Bobcat family was inside. And for the first time in years, Jack realized he wanted to stay, needed to stay, even if it meant facing everything he'd tried to run from. Emily's tears were brief and bitter. She told Jack she didn't come for reconciliation, just to see if he was still alive. She glanced at the shed, at the broken RV, at the man her father had become. Then she turned away, shoulders rigid, the distance between them wider than ever. After they left, Jack sat alone in the workshop, the silence pressing in on all sides. His hands shook, stained with his own blood and the grime of the day. He stared at the half-finished Winnebago, at the battered tools and scattered wood shavings. Memories came unbidden. The night he left the Corps. The pleading look in Emily's young eyes as he walked away from everything that mattered. Guilt clawed at his insides, sharper than any wound the Bobcat could inflict. For a long time, Jack didn't move. He let the cold seep into his bones, let the loneliness swallow him whole. Only the faint sound of kittens breathing kept him anchored in the moment, a reminder that something still needed him. Broken as he was, In that silent workshop, Jack understood a hard truth. Fixing up an old RV wasn't enough. Taking care of wild animals wouldn't fill the hole he'd torn in his family. If he wanted to rebuild what he'd shattered, it would take more than sweat and stubbornness. It would take honesty, humility, and the courage to face the people he'd failed. The night deepened, stars bright against the black sky. Jack sat alone, wounds throbbing, the burden of the past heavy on his shoulders. But for the first time, he made a silent promise, not just to the Bobcat or the broken Winnebago, but to his daughter, his son, and the grandchild he had never met. He would not give up. He would try to make amends, even if forgiveness was out of reach. And as the fire in the stove dwindled to embers, Jack realized that the hardest journey wasn't through snow or shadow, but through the tangled wilderness of regret and hope that lay within his own heart. The days after Emily and Luke's visit were marked by a biting cold that clung to the mountains and settled deep in Jack Turner's bones. In the shed, he found himself drifting between hope and dread, each hour both a promise and a test. The Bobcat family remained, the kittens growing a little stronger every day, their fur fluffing out, their eyes brighter as they tumbled and played within the fragile warmth Jack had managed to create. The mother watched him closely, but seemed to accept at last his presence as part of the landscape. A fact rather than a threat. But Jack's thoughts rarely strayed far from his own fractured family. The sight of his daughter's eyes, at once so familiar and so distant, had left a mark deeper than any wound. For years, Jack had drifted, haunted by regret, letting shame dictate his path. Now, staring at the Winnebago's battered frame, he understood that redemption required more than simply surviving or fixing broken things. It demanded creating something new, something lasting. That morning, as snow drifted against the shed door, Jack set himself a goal. He would transform the old Winnebago into a home worthy of his children and the grandchild he had never met. Not just a place to hide from the world, but a true legacy, a sanctuary that could move and adapt, strong enough to weather storms and soft enough to hold the laughter of family. It was an audacious idea, perhaps foolish, but it filled him with a sense of purpose unlike anything he had felt in years. He began with the bones of the RV, stripping away rot, reinforcing the floor, rebuilding the sagging frame. Each plank he nailed into place was a vow. Each bolt tightened a silent apology. Jack worked with a focus that bordered on obsession, his hands raw and knuckles bleeding, but he welcomed the pain. It grounded him, pulled him out of memories and into the present moment. As he worked, he started carving small wooden animals, gifts for Emily, Luke, and for the child who would soon enter the world. The shapes took time. A bear for strength, a horse for freedom, a bobcat for resilience. He sanded them smooth, etched tiny patterns along their sides, and hid them throughout the Winnebago, in a drawer, tucked into a cabinet, wedged atop the dashboard. Each gift was a promise, an offering for a future he longed to be part of. Outside, the storm clouds gathered. In the evenings, the bobcat and her kittens lingered around the shed, venturing closer as the temperature dropped. Jack found comfort in their presence. The way the kittens chased each other, tumbling across the floor, reminded him of a young Emily and Luke, before life had hardened them all. The mother, her limp almost gone, would sometimes meet his gaze, as if daring him not to give up. In their fragile bond, Jack saw a reflection of his own hopes and failings. But hope, he knew, was never safe from hardship. One night, as he worked late beneath the flickering light of an old lantern, the wind began to rise, shrieking through the eaves of the shed. Snow battered the windows, and the temperature dropped so low it felt as if the world itself had turned to stone. Jack shivered, pulling on every layer he owned, but the cold pressed in, relentless. By midnight, the blizzard was a living thing, pounding the junkyard with fists of ice and snow. Jack listened anxiously as the gale roared outside, the shed trembling under the assault. He checked on the Bobcat family, huddled together in a corner, eyes wide with fear. Then he rushed to the Winnebago, desperate to shore up the work he'd done. Snow had drifted up around the tires, threatening to bury the RV where it stood. The roof creaked ominously beneath the weight of ice. He dragged planks and tarps, stacking them atop the roof, bracing the frame as best he could. The wind howled, driving snow through every crack and seam, numbing his fingers and burning his lungs. Jack fought against the storm, cursing his own weakness, determined to protect the fragile dream he had built. He thought of Emily and Luke, of the grandchild whose face he could only imagine. He thought of the bobcat kittens trembling in the dark. But nature was merciless. With a thunderous crack, part of the shed's roof gave way, beams collapsing under the crushing weight of snow and ice. Jack barely managed to leap aside, wood splintering just inches from where he stood. A torrent of cold air blasted in, sending shivers through his body. The Winnebago itself shuddered, its frame groaning in protest, teetering on the edge of ruin. Jack crawled from the debris, blood seeping from a fresh cut along his temple. For a long moment, he simply lay there, gasping, stunned by the violence of the blizzard. Then, slowly, he rose and dragged himself toward the RV. The roof still held, but he could see the strain, metal bent, windows spider-webbed with frost. He forced himself to keep moving, hammering boards across the worst leaks, shoveling snow from the wheels, his body numb with exhaustion and pain. The bobcat and her kittens huddled in the far corner, watching him with silent intensity. Jack wondered if they understood what he was trying to do, if they sensed the stakes. For them, for him, for the family he was desperate to win back. The blizzard raged on, a relentless force determined to erase all that was fragile or unfinished. As dawn crept slowly toward the horizon, Jack clung to the belief that some things, love, family, the will to begin again, could survive even the harshest storm. In the howling darkness, battered but unbroken, Jack Turner braced himself for whatever would come next, determined to protect the only chance he had left to mend his family. The world was little more than shrieking wind and biting white as Jack fought to save the fragile dream he'd built. The blizzard hammered the junkyard with a vengeance, swirling snow so dense it turned day to dusk. Jack's hands were numb, his face raw from the cold. He stumbled from the shed to the Winnebago and back again, checking on the Bobcat family, bracing walls, praying that each patch and board would hold just a little longer. He could feel the Winnebago's frame shudder beneath the weight of snow piling on the roof, the bitter wind clawing at every seam. The blizzard screamed around him, deafening, relentless, like all the ghosts of his past howling at once. Each time Jack looked at the battered RV, he saw not just rust and rotting wood, but every mistake he'd ever made, each missed birthday, every harsh word, the years of silence that stood between him and his children. He worked harder, pushing himself beyond exhaustion, refusing to let the only chance he had for redemption be swallowed by the storm. But the blizzard was merciless. A sudden gust ripped a tarp from the roof, sending shards of ice clattering across the windshield. Jack scrambled after it, feet slipping, heart thundering in his chest. Overhead, he heard a groan, deep, metallic, a warning. He froze. In the next instant, a heavy wooden beam, loosened by the weight of the snow and the force of the wind, came crashing down. Jack didn't have time to move. The world exploded into pain and blinding white as he was buried beneath the beam and an avalanche of snow and debris. The weight crushed the breath from his lungs, and for a terrifying moment, he was sure he would not rise again. Splinters dug into his side. Blood trickled down his face. He tasted iron, felt the icy bite of snow against his skin. Around him, the blizzard raged, indifferent. Then, through the haze of pain, Jack heard a sound. A low, wild growl, close and urgent. Something was digging, scrabbling through the snow and shattered wood. He blinked through the blur and saw a streak of mottled fur, golden eyes blazing. The bobcat, muscles tense and trembling, lunged at the wreckage. With a force born of pure survival, she shoved at the debris, claws flashing, teeth bared against the storm. Bit by bit, she cleared the wood away, freeing Jack's arms, then his legs. Her kittens huddled nearby, their tiny forms pressed against the wall. Jack's world narrowed to that single moment. Wild animal and broken man, saving each other in the heart of the storm. With a final effort, Jack dragged himself from the wreckage, lungs burning, every limb trembling with pain and cold. He collapsed beside the bobcat, the two of them shivering, battered but alive. For a long time, Jack lay still, breath coming in ragged bursts. He stared at the ceiling of the Winnebago, at the storm pounding just beyond its walls, and tried to summon the strength to rise. Through the shattered window, he saw flashes of light, headlights cutting through the swirling snow. Voices called his name, muffled by the wind but growing clearer, more desperate. He knew them, Emily and Luke, come back through the storm. They burst into the workshop, faces stricken with fear, boots crunching over debris. Emily dropped to her knees at Jack's side, tears freezing on her cheeks. Luke knelt beside her, his hands trembling as he helped dig Jack free from the last of the rubble. Jack tried to speak, but his voice was barely more than a whisper. He forced the words out, rough and raw. "I'm sorry. I was wrong to abandon you." The confession hung in the cold air, more powerful than the blizzard's howl. For years, Jack had kept his sorrow locked away, ashamed to voice the pain he'd caused. But now, battered and bleeding, face to face with the ones he'd lost, he let it spill out. Every regret, every apology, every hope for forgiveness. The wind rattled the walls, but inside the ruined workshop, something softer grew. Emily took Jack's hand, holding it tight. Luke's eyes, always guarded, finally met his father's, and for the first time, Jack saw not anger, but understanding. The storm raged on outside, but inside, a new kind of warmth took hold. The bobcat and her kittens lay curled in a corner, safe for now. Jack's family huddled close, bound together by pain, survival, and a fragile, hard-won hope. For the first time, Jack's confession was clear and decisive, a turning point not just for him, but for everyone gathered in that battered shelter. As the wind finally began to die, Jack looked at the faces of his children and the wild creatures he'd saved. He knew that the real work of mending would take time, but in that storm-battered workshop, he had taken the first true step, one not even the harshest winter could erase. The blizzard's fury had spent itself by dawn, leaving the junkyard battered and half-buried beneath sculpted drifts. For a long time, Jack Turner lay where he'd fallen, the ache in his ribs and head a dull, persistent throb. But through the pain and cold, a deeper sensation bloomed, relief, mingled with a fragile awe. He was alive. So were his children. The Winnebago still stood, battered but upright, a stubborn testament to all that refused to be swept away. Inside the ruined workshop, silence settled at last. Emily's tears had frozen into small pearls on her cheeks, but she didn't let go of her father's hand. Luke moved slowly, stiff with exhaustion, but his eyes held a new steadiness, as if something long blocked had shifted and started to flow. The storm outside had forced them into the same fragile shelter, stripped of pride and pretense. And there, in the ruined heart of the shed, family roots stretched uncertainly toward the thaw. For the first time in years, Jack allowed himself to rest. He drifted in and out of sleep as Emily tended to his wounds with gentle, practical hands. She scolded him, but softer now. Her anger burned away by fear and the stark relief of finding her father alive. Luke cleaned up the debris as best he could, shoveling snow from the threshold, stacking fallen beams in a corner. The old RV groaned as it settled, but did not collapse. Jack's dreams were filled with flashes of wildness. The bobcat's fierce eyes, the tiny trembling kittens, the relentless cold. He woke to find the mother and her young curled up in a patch of sun that streamed through a crack in the boards. For a moment, everything felt simple and right. A man, his children, and a wild animal, all sharing the warmth and quiet after the storm. But not all storms end cleanly. The cost of survival had to be reckoned. When Jack finally sat up, the weight of everything he'd lost and gained settled on his shoulders. His body was bruised and battered, his hands raw and trembling. The Winnebago bore deep dents and a cracked window. The workshop roof hung at a crooked angle, and the tools he'd used so fiercely were scattered or buried. There was so much yet to mend, both around him and within. Yet the air in the shed was changed. Emily moved through the space with less distance. She spoke to Luke in quiet tones, sometimes pausing to rest her hand on her belly. Jack watched her, heart thick with regret and something softer. He realized how long he had dreamed of this. Family together, even in brokenness, but he also saw the cost. The years they'd lost, the pain he'd given, the distance only now beginning to close. Later that morning, as Jack fixed what he could in the Winnebago, Emily appeared beside him. She pressed one of his carved wooden animals, a small bobcat, into his palm. Her fingers lingered for a moment, and her eyes shone with tears. There was no need for words. In that exchange, Jack felt forgiveness might be possible, one fragile step at a time. But life is full of trade-offs. When Jack went back to check on the wild family, he found the space where the bobcat and her kittens had been was empty. Tracks in the snow told the story. Sometime between sunrise and noon, the mother had gathered her young and slipped away, vanishing into the sheltering arms of the forest. Jack stood there for a long time, heart aching with loss. He'd known the wild was never his to keep, but still, the emptiness stung. The bobcat and her kittens had become something more than animals. They were the first companions to share his burden, the first souls to trust him again. Their absence echoed in the shed like the closing of a door. Yet as Jack turned from the empty spot, he felt the gentle pressure of Emily's hand on his shoulder. Luke joined them, standing silent but solid at his side. Together, they looked out over the white world, battered but alive. The bobcat's departure marked the price of coming back. In saving the animal and her young, in risking himself for something wild and fragile, Jack had learned the true meaning of letting go. He had lost the companion that mirrored his wounded soul, but gained the family he'd thought gone forever. The price was steep. scars that would never fully fade, memories that would always ache in winter's deepest nights. But the reward was real: a daughter's quiet forgiveness, a son's returned trust, the slow, steady rebuilding of what mattered most. As dusk settled in and the wind fell silent, Jack sat with Emily and Luke around the battered stove. They shared a simple meal, hands reaching for bread, the silence between them gentler than it had ever been. Jack's gaze lingered on the doorway, half hoping for the flash of a wild tale in the snow, but knowing better. He had made peace with the leaving. Some things, he realized, were meant only to pass through our lives, changing us forever, then returning to their own world. He looked at his children, at Emily's tired smile and the way Luke kept glancing back, just to be sure his father was still there. In that moment, Jack understood. The cost of coming back is never small, but it is always worth paying. Some losses are necessary for greater things to grow. And so, in the quiet aftermath of the storm, Jack Turner let go of what he couldn't keep and held tight to what remained: a battered home, a healing family, and the echo of wildness that would always be part of him. Spring did not come quickly to the Colorado mountains. It crept in quietly, slow and tentative, with days of mist and thin sunlight, and the slow dripping of snowmelt off the junkyard's twisted metal. But when it finally arrived, it brought a hush of green to the hillsides, birdsong threading through the trees, and something gentler in the air: hope, cautious but persistent. For the first time in years, Jack Turner found himself waking up with purpose. Gone was the heavy silence that had once weighed down each morning. Now, as dawn painted the sky a pale pink, Jack moved through his tasks with a sense of anticipation. The Winnebago, battered and mended, stood at the heart of the yard, a testament to months of labor, stubbornness, and the slow healing of both wood and spirit. The scars remained: a crooked window, patches of mismatched paint, the faint line of a dent running along one side. But it was whole, ready, and waiting. Jack worked side by side with Emily and Luke, the three of them patching, painting, cleaning. Sometimes the old tension surfaced: an impatient word, a look that lingered too long on a past hurt. But now those moments faded faster, replaced by the quiet rhythm of shared effort. Jack's hands were never idle, tightening bolts, sanding rough edges, running wiring for the small lamps he'd salvaged from the shed. He watched his daughter carry herself with the quiet confidence of impending motherhood. He saw his son's strength, quieter than before, rooted in forgiveness more than anger. They found the little wooden gifts Jack had hidden throughout the RV, each carved animal a reminder of something lost and something found. Emily discovered the bear tucked behind the sink, tracing the smooth lines with her thumb before slipping it into her coat pocket. Luke grinned when he found the Mustang, running his hand along its arched neck. The Bobcat figurine, carefully set above the dashboard, became their silent mascot, a symbol of resilience and second chances. The day of departure arrived with the sun burning bright and high. Jack made one last check, tightening bolts, wiping grime from the windshield, his heart beating fast with nerves and anticipation. Emily rested her hand on her growing belly, a quiet smile touching her lips. "My son will know his grandfather as a fire, not a shadow," she said once, voice soft but clear. Those words echoed through Jack's mind as he loaded their bags into the Winnebago, more precious than any forgiveness he could have begged for. They rolled out of the junkyard, the engine rumbling with new life, the wheels crunching over old gravel and into the open road. The mountains rose around them, still capped with snow, but the valleys blushed green and gold in the new sun. Jack gripped the wheel, knuckles white, but his spirit soared. Emily sat beside him, window open to the wind. Luke took the back seat, feet propped up, lost in thought. The handmade animals swung gently from the rearview mirror, little guardians for the journey ahead. The trip was simple at first, a slow winding through familiar back roads, the Winnebago's engine humming steady. They passed old landmarks, a half-collapsed barn, the creek where Jack had once taught Emily to fish, a stand of pines where Luke broke his arm climbing too high. Jack's heart ached with memories, but he let them come, unafraid. The past was not something to outrun anymore, but something to carry, honestly, openly, with eyes on the road ahead. At night they parked beside a small lake, water black and still beneath a sky thick with stars. Jack sat with Emily and Luke beside a small fire, the silence between them warm. They spoke in low voices, sharing stories, some funny, some hard, all true. The old pain was still there, but now it lived alongside laughter and hope. Emily's hand rested on her belly. "He'll know you, Dad," she said softly. "He'll know what it means to fight for family." Jack closed his eyes and let the words settle, as gentle as the breeze stirring the lake's surface. In the mornings, Jack rose before the others, stepping outside to breathe the clean, wild air. He scanned the tree line, half expecting to catch a glimpse of a tawny shape, golden eyes gleaming from the undergrowth. Sometimes, in the hush just before dawn, he saw small tracks near the edge of the woods, bobcat prints, with the tiny imprints of kittens beside them. Jack smiled to himself, a quiet gratitude blooming in his chest. Even the wild protected its young at all costs. Humans, he realized, had no excuse to give up on family. As they continued their journey, Jack felt the world opening up again. Each mile was a reminder. True legacy is not possessions, but the love we carry forward. It's the work of mending, day after day, the choice to stay present even when it's hard. In the company of his children and the quiet memory of the wild bobcat, Jack Turner discovered that redemption is not a single act, but a road taken together, one patient mile at a time. And as the Winnebago wound its way into the mountains, Jack knew, whatever else the future held, his family's story was not finished. It was only just beginning, every mile a chance to write a new chapter, together. The Winnebago rolled down the mountain road, sunlight flickering through the pines, dust rising in its wake. Inside, the Turner family felt the weight of winter truly lift for the first time, its scars and silence replaced by something steadier, warmer. Jack drove with the window cracked open, letting the scent of pine needles and thawing earth fill the cab. Each mile felt lighter than the last, the memory of the blizzard fading like old pain in the presence of new hope. They traveled slowly, letting the journey become its own destination. There was no schedule, no looming need to prove anything. Some days they stopped by the side of the road just to watch a herd of elk pass, or to let Emily stretch in the grass and talk quietly to her unborn son, voice blending with the wind. Other days they followed the rivers, watching trout leap through the meltwater, Luke sketching the scene with quick, sure lines in the notebook he always carried. Everywhere Jack looked, there were small signs of renewal. The scarred woods, stripped bare by winter's teeth, now shimmered with tiny green shoots. Snowmelt gathered in clear pools, reflecting the sky. The mountains themselves seemed gentler, as if the world had recognized the effort of their struggle and offered up a blessing. Even the old Winnebago, patched, battered, but still running, felt transformed, not by perfection, but by perseverance. One afternoon, after a long stretch of quiet highway, Jack pulled the Winnebago to a stop beneath a stand of trembling aspens. Emily stepped out first, her hair catching the late light, one hand on her stomach as she took in the air. Luke followed, stretching arms still stiff from the road, his eyes brighter and less guarded than they had been in months. Jack climbed down last, moving carefully, but with a new confidence in his step. They picnicked on the edge of the forest, bread and cheese spread across a blanket, laughter coming easier now. When the meal was done, Emily wandered off, following a narrow path into the trees. Luke and Jack tidied up, falling into a companionable silence broken only by the songs of unseen birds. It was then that Jack noticed the tracks, small, fresh, pressed lightly into the soft earth just beyond the edge of the clearing. He knelt to study them. The distinctive shape was unmistakable. Bobcat prints, and beside them, a series of tiny paws, weaving in and out of the larger ones. He smiled, feeling a surge of recognition and bittersweet pride. The wild family he'd sheltered had survived the long winter, and here, in this place, they too were beginning again. He rose, brushing dirt from his knees, and caught Emily's eye as she returned from the trees. She looked at him, following his gaze, and her smile was all the answer he needed. For a long moment, they stood together, watching the line of prints disappear into the forest, a reminder that some things can never truly be held, only honored as they pass through our lives. As evening settled, Jack found himself sitting at the edge of the woods, reflecting on everything that had changed. He thought of the old wounds, his mistakes, the years lost to shame and silence. He remembered the storm, the wild fear, and the way forgiveness had come not in a flood, but drop by patient drop. He looked at his children and at the promise of a grandchild soon to be born. He realized that family, whether fierce or fragile, is not something that can be measured by the past alone. It is made and remade every day, in the choices to stay, to mend, to try again. The next morning, as they prepared to travel on, Jack lingered by the tree line. He pressed his palm into the earth beside the bobcat tracks, feeling the cold and the promise of growth beneath. He knew he couldn't keep everything, couldn't turn back time, couldn't erase loss. But he understood now that some things stay with us forever, written in the scars we share and the memories we build. The forest would keep its secrets, but Jack carried its lessons with him. Driving away, the Winnebago traced a winding path toward new places, carrying more than just 3 travelers. In the gentle sway of the cabin, the handmade gifts Jack had carved knocked gently together, wooden bear, Mustang, Bobcat, a quiet chorus of everything they had survived and rebuilt. And so Jack Turner, once the town failure, now the heart of a small, stubborn legacy, smiled as he watched the world roll by. He thought of the wild bobcat, the kittens, the tracks fading into green shadow. He thought of the question left hanging. What could change a life? A moment, an animal, a storm, a choice. Maybe, he mused, the answer was as simple and as wild as love itself. As dusk fell, the road gleamed ahead, and Jack's spirit moved forward, rooted and renewed. Some journeys are measured in miles, but the truest ones are counted in forgiveness, in second chances, and in the quiet, unstoppable return of hope. Family, fragile or fierce, is the force that brings us back to life. Sometimes, the wildest parts of ourselves lead us home. If a wild bobcat could change a veteran's life, what about you? Have you ever had an animal or a small moment change your life forever? Share your story in the comments below.